So Henry VIII, let's talk about Henry and whether he qualifies as a Protestant or not. I mean, certainly he led a protest movement against the Catholic Church. Henry's born at Greenwich Palace in England. He's the son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. 1509, and there's a lot of dum-da-dum-dum moments with Henry VIII. This is one of them, dum-da-dum-dum, in 1509. He marries Catherine of Aragon, who happens to be cousin or niece, I can't remember, of Charles V, the King of Spain. So this is an attempt to make England an ally of Spain. And that's all going to fall apart very, very quickly. Culminating next week, you'll have to come back to hear how it culminates with the defeat of the Armada. 1516, Queen Catherine gives birth to a girl. So there's not a successor, and the girl's name is Princess Mary, who will later become Queen of England. 1520, Henry VIII publishes the Defense of the Seven Sacraments, refuting Luther. How many sacraments did Luther think there was? Just 2. So Henry writes Defense of the Seven Sacraments, and he is named Defender of the Faith by the Pope. And there is some irony in this, considering what is going to happen over the next 16 years. 1527 to 29, Henry VIII seeks an annulment from Pope Clement VII of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And the reason is because she hasn't produced the male heir. She just produced this girl called Mary. The annulment is refused. The Pope disses the king and says, "The heck with you." Now, the reason that the grounds upon which Henry was seeking the divorce is because Catherine of Aragon was married to Henry's brother, who died. So in the Catholic Church, you're not supposed to marry your brother's widow. And he had actually gotten permission from the Pope at the time to marry his brother's widow, but now he was using that as his excuse for why they should be allowed to get divorced, is because, well, wait a second, he's my brother's widow. I shouldn't have been allowed to marry him in the first place. But wait a second, you wanted to, but, you know, on and on and on. 1533, Henry goes ahead with a divorce anyway, and marries his second wife, Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn is a secretly practicing Protestant. She's a secret Lutheran. And she's supporting the Lutheran movement within England during the time she is married to Henry VIII, who you will recall is the defender of the faith in the Catholic Church. They have a child also, and her name is Elizabeth. And Elizabeth will one day become perhaps the greatest sovereign in English history. 1534, Henry VIII leads the passage of the Act of Supremacy. This officially forms the Church of England with the king as its head. And we should point out that at this point, everything about the English service is still Catholic. The liturgy is still, the Mass is still in Latin. The priests still are not allowed to marry. The monastery system, the 800 monasteries and nunneries in England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland are still flourishing. So this is still essentially a Catholic church, except that the king has booted the Pope out as the head of it. 1535, Sir Thomas More is beheaded for not publicly approving of the marriage of Henry VIII to his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Sir Thomas More was his chief advisor and also Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he didn't come out against the marriage. He simply refused to comment on it, and that was enough for him to lose his head. Now, Tyndale did publicly come out against the marriage, and he fled to the continent, and Henry VIII sent spies who tracked him down and turned him over to the Inquisition. 1536, Henry orders his second wife, Anne Boleyn, executed. The real reason is because she has not produced a male heir. There is a raft of charges against her, including treason and heresy. There were rumors she was sleeping around on him. I don't know if those were true or not. I think by that point Henry had heard that she was a secret Lutheran and she was aiding and abetting the Lutherans in the kingdom. But anyway, she's executed. From 1536 to 1540, and we've already talked about this in some detail, so we won't be doing it again today. Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell. This is not
Oliver.
This is not Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector. This would be his great uncle, I think. Anyway, Oliver Cromwell was related to Thomas Cromwell. Anyway, Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell systematically dissolved and destroyed the monastery system in England. And they didn't just destroy the system, they actually physically destroyed many of the monasteries. 1536 to 1537, there's an uprising in the north because there are some staunch Catholics up in the northern part of England, in the Yorkshire moors and those places. They are appalled that Henry is dissolving the monasteries. They're appalled that he has put himself in the position of the Pope. So they have this uprising. It's called the Pilgrimage of Grace. So it's actually a revolt, and Henry actually has to take troops up into the northern part of England to suppress this. He manages to suppress it. Really, the show of force is probably sufficient. I mean, there's not some big battle or something. But he also takes along, he takes along his new wife, which ticks some people off because they're still supporters of Catherine of Aragon. But he also takes along his young daughter, Princess Mary. And as the king is riding into the towns up there, and the people are surrounding both sides of the road, it is not the king or his new bride that people are cheering. It is Princess Mary that they are cheering because they know she's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. 1547, Henry dies in the Palace of Whitehall. 1553 to 1558, Queen Mary I restores Catholicism. 300 Protestant dissenters are executed, including 3 very prominent bishops. One we're going to talk about in detail in a moment, named Thomas Cranmer. The other 2 were named Latimer and Ridley. And in 1558 to 1603, Queen Elizabeth I restores the Church of England as the official religion of England and assumes the title of the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a title which her father had had before her. I think I'm going to say a few words, because I think we have the time today, about the secession. And this is something I've made comments in the past which are actually true comments, but I never explained them. And I'm going to try to explain them now, although genealogy is not my strong point. My wife, April Wegner, they're experts in genealogy. It is not my strong point, but I'm going to do my best here. In the past, I remember just a few weeks ago, I made the statement that Mary, Queen of Scots, was probably every bit as much in line for the throne as Elizabeth was, which was why it was so astonishing that when John Knox threw her out of Scotland, that where does she go for help? She comes to England. She comes to Elizabeth I, who is perfectly aware that Mary, Queen of Scots, is as much in line for the throne as Elizabeth I was. So let's talk about that a moment. Henry VIII does have a son, and we've already talked about him. His name is Edward VI. And Edward, during the time of, if you want to look at the 2 periods when England is the most Protestant, has adopted all of the Protestant, the liturgy, everything, Protestant. It's the rule of Edward VI, and then the rule later of Oliver Cromwell. So Edward VI is the son of Henry VIII,
Boy king.
the boy king, and he brings Protestant practice to England. We've already talked about all that. But he's the legitimate heir, nobody can argue with, because he's the son of Henry VIII. Now, because Henry VIII so much wanted his son to be King of England, that he had declared that Mary and Elizabeth were bastards. Now they weren't, because he was married to their mothers, so they weren't. But he officially declared that they were bastards. because he didn't want anybody arguing that either one of them should be in line for the throne ahead of his son, Edward VI. Well, the problem was Edward VI became king when he was, what, 8 years old or something. And he died when he was 15 and a half or 16. I don't remember exactly. He dies of tuberculosis. So this sets up a crisis in the succession. Because under normal circumstances, under normal circumstances, the crown would go to a nephew of the dead king, or in this case, a cousin of Edward VI. Well, there was a problem. All of his cousins, all 7 of them, were female. So there's no cousins, or nephews of Henry VIII to take over as king. So of course, everyone now turns their attention to who? To Mary and Elizabeth. But he's already officially declared them to be bastards. So as Edward VI is on his deathbed, he is horribly concerned about this situation. And he knows that his sister, Mary, she's a Catholic. And she would be next in line. But she's a Catholic, and he spent his whole reign turning England into something as Protestant as Calvin's Geneva. So he writes this long letter about what the succession should be. Now, he wouldn't mind his sis Elizabeth becoming queen, but the problem is Mary would be first in line in the succession because she's older. So, of course, he briefly looks at his 7 cousins, and they're all female. And here's finally, we're getting to the point. One of those 7 cousins is Mary, Queen of Scots. So, since both Mary, the woman who will become Queen Mary, and Elizabeth have been declared bastards, and there are no male heirs on the cousins of Edward VI, so you have these 7 women. Well, any one of them could be considered the heir to the throne, including Mary, Queen of Scots. So you're Edward VI, you're super Protestant, you have brought Protestantism to England.
With the fervor of a 15-year-old.
With the fervor of a 15-year-old. The fanaticism of a 15-year-old. And not only is his sister, who would be first in line to the throne under normal circumstances, a Catholic, but Mary, Queen of Scots, too, is a Catholic. So there's no way on this earth he is going to allow Mary, Queen of Scots, to become Queen of England. So he picks another one of his cousins, and her name is Lady Jane Grey. We actually mentioned her name a few times in this class. And he names that she should be his successor. So Lady Jane Grey, who was also 15 years old at the time,
And very naive.
and very naive, as naive as Mary, Queen of Scots was when she came to Edinburgh and took over as queen, and thought there would be all these multitudes throwing flowers in her path, and instead she runs into John Knox standing on a cliff and telling her she was the devil and she should go home. But Lady Jane Grey is every bit as naive. So Lady Jane Grey, a bunch of dukes and earls, they decided she is going to become the queen, and they announced to the English populace that their new queen is going to be Lady Jane Grey. Well, the problem is nobody in England had heard of Lady Jane Grey. They didn't even know she existed. They all had heard of Mary, not Scots, Mary Tudor. They all had heard of Mary Tudor. So there was this period in England where there was this upheaval. Lady Jane Grey had been announced as being the queen. She had not yet been crowned, though. Mary Tudor, meanwhile, does probably the smartest thing of her reign. She sends out a series of letters. Now today they use email. She'd use email, or she'd use text message, or Facebook, or she'd tweet it.
Instagram.
She sends a personal letter to every one of the English dukes and earls and says, hey, guess what? I am next in line of succession. I don't care what my windbag father said about me being a bastard. I am not a bastard. He was legally married to of Catherine of Aragon at the time I was born. I am next in line of succession. And guess what? Suddenly, from all over England, troops start arriving at her castle, and she eventually amasses a force far bigger than the forces available to Lady Jane Grey. Lady Jane Grey, who didn't want to become queen in the first place, graciously renounces herself as king, and Mary becomes the Queen of England. But that's when I've said things like, yeah, so of course Mary only reigns 4 years, and when she dies, Elizabeth becomes the Queen. But that's why when I say that Mary, Queen of Scots, is probably every bit as much in line for the throne as Elizabeth was. But the reason Elizabeth gets it and Mary, Queen of Scots doesn't is because Mary, Queen of Scots is Catholic. Does it all make sense now? Okay. I mean, I am aware of other families that they only seem to produce female children, and they don't seem to produce any male children. I mean, if you look at these two here, 5 kids, all female. So this can happen, and this is what happened to Henry.
So Lady Jane Grey never became queen. She was only considered for queen.
Yeah, it was announced that she was going to be queen, but she never went through the coronation.
Did she get put in jail or anything?
Yes.
Okay.
After Mary came into England with an army, or into London, she put Lady Jane Grey into the Tower. About a year or 2 into Mary's rule, there was another uprising in the north led by a guy named Wyatt. It's called Wyatt's Rebellion. And the goal was Wyatt was going to lead this army into London. They were going to free Lady Jane Grey and make her queen. Mary suppresses this rebellion and realizes that as long as poor Lady Jane Grey is alive, there are going to be forces that are going to try to make her queen. So she has poor Lady Jane Grey executed. So I hope that's all clear now, the whole line of succession.
Was there any question when Elizabeth took the crown because of her dad saying, you know, she's not my kid?
No, but
that was all gone by the time?
Since they had allowed Mary Tudor to take the crown, by the time Elizabeth came along, nobody was even making that argument.
So this is a stupid question. Which one was Bloody Mary? Mary Tudor or
Mary
Mary
Tudor.
Queen of Scots?
Mary Tudor.
Okay, because
She's Bloody Mary
killed
because
a lot of
she
Protestants.
murdered, executed in cold blood the 300 Protestant leaders, which included 3 bishops, the most prominent being Cranmer, who we're going to talk about now. There's Henry VIII. He created the Church of England, and he made himself the head. He's often considered one of the big 3 movements that came out of the Reformation. And interestingly enough, Catholics are the ones most likely to identify him as one of the big 3 because they like to view him as this kind of fat, fanatical blob who just wanted to get power for himself.
And
along with John Calvin and Martin Luther, who they equally despised but respected more than they respected Henry. He didn't start out with the intention of leaving the Catholic Church. He'd been named Defender of the Faith by the Pope. And he certainly didn't think of himself as a Protestant sovereign. He suppressed followers of Luther. Henry's Chancellor, Sir Thomas More, wrote 9 books against the Tyndale heresy. What?
you just needed to move over a little bit. That's what the hand signals for.
I just don't even ask anymore.
You thought it was a dietary problem.
And Sir Thomas More wrote 9 books against the Tyndale heresy. Henry wanted a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The Pope at the time was under the influence of the Holy Roman Emperor, which was Catherine's relative, Emperor Charles V. He's probably the most powerful guy in Europe at the time. And again, I can't remember if it was his niece or his cousin, but either way, she marries Henry, and now Henry wants a divorce because the Pope is under the control, to some extent, of Charles V. the Pope refuses the request for annulment. Henry goes on to create the Church of England, puts himself in charge. He destroys the Roman Catholic monastic system in England in a brutal 4-year period. During Henry's reign, the Church of England maintained much of the form and ritual of the Roman Catholic Church, and it was in every sense an entity independent from the Roman Church. But, as I said before, the liturgy is still in Latin, the priests can't get married. They're still doing the 7 sacraments, all of this stuff. Now, this does not mean that there were not people in England who were trying to make the English church more Protestant. There were people in England doing that, including his close advisor, Thomas Cromwell, who was doing everything he could to make the services more Protestant. For example, Thomas Cromwell dictated that every church in England have a Bible written in English in the church so that the common people could come in and they could read the Bible. So Cromwell was certainly fighting for the church to become more Protestant. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is doing everything he can to make the English church more Protestant. But they can only go so far because Henry's the king, and Henry is still basically a Catholic at heart, except it didn't bother him to diss the Pope. But the seeds of the Protestant movement are percolating while Henry VIII is still the king. Now, they won't blossom until Edward VI, but they are percolating under the ground. Henry's 2 daughters would continue this conflict between Protestant and Catholic. Queen Mary, or Mary Tudor, also known as Bloody Mary, restored Catholicism during her reign and ordered the execution of Protestant dissidents. She also marries the weasel son of Charles V. She actually marries Philip, the son of Charles V. So she marries a Spanish crown prince, if you will, which does not endear her to her subjects. And here, a bit of irony here, by the time of Elizabeth's reign, when the Spanish Armada is going to attack England, guess who is leading the Spanish Armada? Philip, the former husband of Mary Tudor. Her half-sister Elizabeth would restore the Church of England and reign for 45 years in what is often called England's Golden Age.
Robert, why didn't Spain attack England? They were very powerful, and he disrespected Catherine of Aragon, and they disrespected the Pope. So shouldn't they have attacked?
Then, as opposed to later.
Yeah.
They could have, but it was like I was saying earlier, dissing his cousin. Henry VIII locks her up in a castle, I forget which one, but it's a really nice castle.
Okay.
And she
Gilded
has,
cage.
you know, she's living in luxury, and she has attendants and all of this stuff. So it's not like he threw her into the tower. If he'd thrown her into a tower, that's different.
Okay.
But he didn't go that far. So he went as far as he could without really ticking off Spain and having Spain.
It was an international incident. It wasn't cause for war.
Correct.
At this point. It was,
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. It's just like, look at the balancing act the United States is doing with Syria right now. I mean, we basically said, if Syria uses chemical weapons, then may God have mercy on your soul. So far, they have not. So
No, if
we all have
they
our
use them
right
against their own
lines.
people. If they use them against Israel, then it's another story. They specified against their own people.
So Henry VIII is the person who, from a governmental standpoint, pulls away from the Catholic Church, creates the Church of England, and puts the king in charge of it. But Henry VIII does not go so far as to really make the English